Sarah Matthews sat at her worn kitchen table, the wood scarred from years of family meals and homework sessions. The late afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the scattered pile of bills before her. Each envelope seemed to mock her, a stark reminder of the financial tightrope she'd been walking since Tom's death 2 years ago. At 38, Sarah felt decades older. Her once vibrant auburn hair now sported strands of grey at the temples, and fine lines had etched themselves around her eyes, as much from worry as from laughter. She absently twirled her wedding ring, a habit she'd developed in the lonely months since the accident that had torn her world apart. From the living room came the sounds of her children playing, a cacophony of laughter, bickering, and the clatter of toys. 11-year-old Michael's voice rose above the din, his patient tone a mirror of his late father's as he explained the rules of a board game to his younger siblings. "No, Jamie, you can't move your piece there," Michael was saying. "Remember, you can only go forward, not backward." 6-year-old Jamie's frustrated whine followed. "But I want to go there." "Those are the rules, Squirt," Michael replied, his voice tinged with the exasperated affection of an older brother. 9-year-old Lily's giggle punctuated the exchange. "Jamie, you're so silly!" A small smile tugged at Sarah's lips despite her worries. Her children were her world, the reason she got up each morning and pushed through the hardships. Michael, her biological son, had stepped up remarkably since Tom's death, taking on a protective role over his adopted siblings. Lily and Jamie, both adopted as infants, had brought so much joy into their lives. The decision to adopt had been an easy one for Sarah and Tom, their hearts big enough to embrace children who needed a home. Sarah's eyes drifted back to the bills, and her smile faded. The substitute teaching gigs weren't cutting it anymore. Between the mortgage, utilities, groceries, and the seemingly endless stream of expenses that came with raising 3 growing children, they were barely treading water. Something had to change, and soon. Her gaze fell on the local newspaper folded neatly at the corner of the table. On a whim, she pulled it closer and flipped to the classifieds section. Her eyes skimmed over the familiar listings: retail positions, office work, waitressing jobs. Nothing that could support a family of 4. Just as she was about to close the paper in frustration, a small ad caught her eye. Housekeeper needed for Oakwood Manor. Flexible hours, competitive pay. Experience preferred but not required. Sarah's heart quickened. Oakwood Manor. Everyone in town knew of the sprawling estate on the hill, owned by the reclusive Caldwell family. They were rarely seen in town, the mansion standing empty most of the year except for occasional gatherings or events. She read the ad again, her mind racing. The pay listed was significantly higher than anything else she'd seen, and the flexible hours could work well with the kids' schedules. But what did she know about being a housekeeper for a mansion? Her cleaning experience was limited to their small apartment and her classroom when she was teaching. "Mom, what's for dinner? I'm starving!" Lily's voice broke through Sarah's thoughts. Sarah glanced at the clock, surprised to see how late it had gotten. "Just a minute, sweetie," she called back. "I'll start on it now." As she moved around the small kitchen, pulling out pots and pans, Sarah's mind kept drifting back to the job ad. It was a long shot, sure, but wasn't any chance worth taking at this point. She was stirring a pot of spaghetti sauce when she overheard a quiet conversation from the living room. "But when are we getting new school supplies?" Jamie was asking, his voice small and worried. "Don't worry about it, buddy," Michael replied softly. "Mum will figure it out. She always does." "Yeah," Lily chimed in. "Remember last year when she made us those cool book covers out of paper bags? That was fun!" Sarah's heart clenched. Her children were trying so hard to be brave, to make the best of their situation. They deserved so much more than scraping by, more than hand-me-downs and makeshift school supplies. In that moment, Sarah's decision was made. She would apply for the job at Oakwood Manor. What did she have to lose? "Dinner's ready," she called out, pushing aside her worries for now. "Come set the table, please." The kitchen was soon filled with the chaos of family dinner, passing dishes, negotiating over who got the last garlic bread, and sharing stories from their day. Sarah soaked it all in, drawing strength from the love that surrounded her despite their hardships. After dinner, after the dishes were done and homework was checked, Sarah tucked each child into bed. She kissed Michael's forehead, smiling at how he tried to act too grown up for bedtime rituals, but still leaned into her embrace. She read a story to Lily and Jamie, their eyes growing heavy as they snuggled together in the bottom bunk of their shared room. "Mum," Lily murmured as Sarah was about to turn off the light. "Yes, sweetheart." "Are we going to be okay?" Sarah's throat tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course we are, Lilybug. We've got each other, don't we? That makes us the luckiest family in the world." Lily smiled sleepily, apparently satisfied with this answer. "Love you, Mom." "Love you too, baby. All of you. Sweet dreams." Sarah closed the door softly behind her, then made her way back to the kitchen. She cleared a space at the table and sat down with a notepad and pen. The single lamp cast a warm glow as she began to write, her determination growing with each word. "Dear Sir or Madam," she began, then paused. Was that too formal? Too old-fashioned? She crumpled the paper and started again. "To whom it may concern, I am writing to express my strong interest in the housekeeper position at Oakwood Manor, as advertised in the Millbrook Gazette." Sarah wrote and rewrote, pouring her heart into the application letter. She detailed her experience as a teacher, emphasizing her organizational skills and attention to detail. She wrote of her quick learning ability, her strong work ethic, and her commitment to excellence in any task she undertook. As the night wore on, Sarah found herself opening up more than she had intended. She wrote of her determination to provide for her children, of her willingness to take on any challenge. The words flowed from her pen, honest and heartfelt. While I may not have specific experience as a housekeeper for a large estate, I am confident that my skills, dedication, and eagerness to learn make me an excellent candidate for this position. I am hardworking, reliable, and committed to maintaining the highest standards in all that I do. I would welcome the opportunity to discuss how my abilities can contribute to the upkeep and management of Oakwood Manor. Thank you for your consideration. Sincerely, Sarah Matthews. Sarah read over the letter one last time, making a few small adjustments. It wasn't perfect, but it was genuine. She could only hope that would count for something. With a yawn, she glanced at the clock. 1:23 a.m. She'd been writing for hours, but for the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. Tomorrow, she would drop the kids off at school, then take the bus to Oakwood Manor to deliver her application in person. It was a bold move, but she couldn't afford to wait for the mail. As she got ready for bed, Sarah's mind was already racing ahead. What would she wear? How would she arrange childcare if she got an interview? What if by some miracle she actually got the job? Sleep was elusive that night, her dreams filled with sprawling mansions and endless possibilities. Morning came too soon, heralded by the insistent beeping of her alarm clock. Sarah dragged herself out of bed, the weight of too little sleep pulling at her limbs. But as the events of last night came back to her, a surge of energy propelled her into action. The morning routine was a well-choreographed dance of breakfast making, lunch packing, and last-minute homework checks. Sarah moved through it all with an extra spring in her step, her secret hope buoying her spirits. "Mom, why are you so cheerful?" Michael asked suspiciously over his bowl of cereal. "It's weird," Sarah laughed, ruffling his hair as she passed. "Can't a mom just be in a good mood?" "I like it when you're happy, Mommy," Jamie said, milk dribbling down his chin. "Me too, Peanut," Sarah replied, wiping his face with a napkin. "Now let's move on. Bus will be here in 10 minutes. After the whirlwind of getting 3 children out the door, Sarah finally had a moment to herself. She stood in front of the mirror, scrutinizing her reflection. The dark circles under her eyes were a permanent fixture these days, but she did her best to conceal them with makeup. She put on her best blouse, a bit worn at the cuffs, but still presentable, and a pair of slacks she hoped looked professional enough. With one last glance around the apartment to make sure she hadn't forgotten anything, Sarah grabbed her purse and the envelope containing her application letter. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped out into the morning sunshine. The bus ride to the affluent part of town seemed to take forever. Sarah watched as the familiar sights of her neighborhood gave way to increasingly grand houses and manicured lawns. With each passing minute, her nervousness grew. What was she thinking, applying for a job like this? She was so out of her depth. But then she thought of her children, of Michael's quiet strength, Lily's infectious laughter, Jamie's boundless enthusiasm. She thought of the bills piling up on the kitchen table, of the sacrifices they'd all had to make. This wasn't just about her. It was about giving her family a chance at a better life. Finally, the bus wheezed to a stop at the base of the hill where Oakwood Manor stood. Sarah thanked the driver and stepped off, her legs feeling oddly wobbly beneath her. The walk up the hill was steep, and Sarah was out of breath by the time she reached the imposing wrought-iron gates of the estate. Beyond them, she could see the mansion itself, a sprawling edifice of stone and timber that seemed to touch the sky. Manicured lawns stretched in every direction, dotted with ancient oak trees and meticulously maintained flower beds. For a moment, Sarah's resolve wavered. This world was so far removed from her own. What chance did she really have? But then, unbidden, Jamie's voice echoed in her mind. "I like it when you're happy, Mommy." Sarah squared her shoulders. She was here for her children, for their future. She couldn't back down now. With a deep breath, she reached out and pressed the intercom button beside the gate. Her finger trembled slightly, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Hello, my name is Sarah Matthews. I'm here about the housekeeper position." There was a pause, then a crackle of static. A crisp, professional voice responded. "One moment, please." The gates began to swing open with a low creak. Sarah took one last look behind her, at the familiar world she was leaving behind. Then, clutching her application letter like a lifeline, she stepped forward into the unknown. As the gates closed behind her, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Little did she know just how right she was, or the extraordinary journey that awaited her beyond those gates. The adventure was just beginning. The massive oak door of Oakwood Manor swung open with an ominous creak, revealing a stern-faced woman in her late 50s. Her salt and pepper hair was pulled back into a tight bun, and her crisp black dress with a white collar gave her the air of a Victorian housekeeper straight out of a period drama. "Mrs. Matthews, I presume?" The woman's voice was as starched as her appearance. Sarah nodded, suddenly feeling very small and out of place. "Yes, that's me. I'm here about the housekeeper position." "Indeed, I am Mrs. Havisham, the head housekeeper. Come along. We haven't got all day." Without waiting for a response, Mrs. Havisham turned on her heel and strode into the mansion. Sarah hurried after her, her sensible shoes squeaking slightly on the polished marble floor. The entrance hall alone was larger than Sarah's entire apartment. A crystal chandelier the size of her car hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting prismatic patterns across the room. Priceless artworks adorned the walls, their gilt frames gleaming in the soft light. "This way," Mrs. Havisham called, already halfway up a sweeping staircase. Sarah quickened her pace, trying to take in her surroundings while keeping up with Mrs. Havisham's brisk tour. They passed through room after room, each more opulent than the last. A formal dining room with a table that could seat 20. A library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and leather-bound volumes. A ballroom with parquet floors so shiny Sarah could see her reflection in them. "And this," Mrs. Havisham said, pushing open a pair of double doors, "is the conservatory." Sarah gasped audibly. The room was a wonderland of greenery and flowers, with a glass ceiling that soared overhead. Exotic plants she couldn't name filled ornate pots, and a small fountain burbled peacefully in one corner. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed. Mrs. Havisham's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, it is rather nice, isn't it? Now come along. There's still much to see." As they continued their tour, Mrs. Havisham rattled off a list of duties and expectations. Sarah's head spun trying to keep up, dusting the chandeliers weekly, polishing the silver every third day, rotating the artwork quarterly to prevent sun damage. It seemed endless. "Any questions?" Mrs. Havisham asked as they returned to the entrance hall. Sarah opened her mouth, then closed it again. She had 1,000 questions but didn't know where to start. I think I'll learn as I go," she managed finally. Mrs. Havisham nodded curtly. "Very well. Let's introduce you to the rest of the staff." They made their way to the kitchen, a vast space filled with gleaming stainless steel appliances that looked like they belonged in a restaurant rather than a home. A handful of people were gathered around a large central island, sipping tea and chatting. "Everyone," Mrs. Havisham announced, "this is Sarah Matthews. She'll be joining our housekeeping staff on a trial basis." A chorus of hellos greeted Sarah. She smiled nervously, taking in the friendly faces. There was Maria, the cook, a plump woman with laugh lines around her eyes. James, the groundskeeper, his hands calloused from years of tending the estate's vast gardens. Emily and Laura, 2 young maids who giggled and whispered to each other. And then there was the old man. He sat apart from the others, perched on a stool in the corner. Unlike the rest of the staff, he didn't greet Sarah. He simply watched her with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through her. "That's Mr. Garrett," Mrs. Havisham said, following Sarah's gaze. "He's been with the family for, well, longer than any of us can remember. Doesn't speak much these days, but there's not much that escapes his notice." Mr. Garrett nodded once at Sarah, then returned his attention to the cup of tea in his gnarled hands. "Right," Mrs. Havisham said briskly. "Time to get to work. Emily, show Sarah where to find the cleaning supplies. Start her in the guest rooms on the 2nd floor." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah followed Emily from room to room, trying to absorb the wealth of information the young maid shared. There were specific cleaning products for each type of surface. One for the marble, another for the hardwood, yet another for the antique furniture. "Whatever you do," Emily warned, "don't use the wrong product on anything. Mrs. Havisham will have your head." Sarah nodded, feeling overwhelmed. She started on her first task, dusting a guest room that was larger than her children's bedrooms combined. As she worked, she couldn't help but marvel at the luxury surrounding her. The sheets on the bed probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. Despite her best efforts, Sarah made several mistakes throughout the morning. She used the wrong duster on a delicate vase, leaving tiny scratches that made Mrs. Havisham purse her lips in disapproval. She struggled with the complicated settings on the vacuum cleaner, a high-tech monster that bore little resemblance to her ancient model at home. By the time lunch break rolled around, Sarah's nerves were frayed. She sat alone in the staff kitchen, picking at a sandwich and trying not to let her doubts overwhelm her. This job was so far out of her comfort zone. What had she been thinking? As she ate, she couldn't help but overhear a conversation between Emily and Laura at the next table. "I heard they're planning another gala next month," Emily was saying in a hushed voice. Laura leaned in, eyes wide. "Really? But they were just here for the summer solstice party." "I know, but you know how they are. Always looking for an excuse to show off." "Well, I suppose when you have this much money, you can do whatever you want." Sarah's ears perked up. She'd been so focused on learning her duties that she'd almost forgotten about the mansion's elusive owners. "Excuse me," she said, turning to the young maids. "Who are you talking about?" Emily and Laura exchanged glances. "The Caldwells," Emily said finally, "the family that owns the manor." "They don't live here." Laura shook her head. "Oh no, they have homes all over the world. They only come here a few times a year for special events." "And every time they do, it's absolute chaos," Emily added. "Everything has to be perfect. Mrs. Havisham runs us ragged for weeks beforehand." Sarah nodded, filing away this information. It explained the immaculate state of rooms that seemed rarely used. The rest of the day passed in a blur of cleaning, polishing, and more than a few mistakes. By the time Mrs. Havisham dismissed her, every muscle in Sarah's body ached. She'd used muscles she didn't even know she had. As she waited at the bus stop, Sarah couldn't help but feel a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The work was hard, harder than she'd anticipated. But there was also a sense of accomplishment. She'd survived her first day in a world so different from her own. On the bus ride home, Sarah pulled out a small notebook and began to calculate. Even after taxes, her first paycheck would cover the overdue electric bill and put a dent in their credit card debt. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. A small smile played on her lips as she imagined telling the kids they could buy new school supplies. The smile faded as she glanced at her watch. It was later than she'd realized. The kids would be worried. She'd have to figure out a better childcare arrangement if this job worked out. When she finally trudged up the stairs to their apartment, she was greeted by a chorus of "Mom!" and a flurry of hugs. "Where were you?" Michael asked, his brow furrowed with concern. "Yeah, we were worried," Lily added. "I'm sorry, sweethearts," Sarah said, hugging them close. "I got a new job and it ran later than I expected, but don't worry, we'll figure it out." After a quick dinner of reheated leftovers and promises to explain everything tomorrow, Sarah finally fell into bed. As she drifted off to sleep, her mind swirled with images from the day: crystal chandeliers, priceless artworks, rooms larger than their entire apartment, and underlying it all, a sense that she was standing on the threshold of something big, something that could change their lives in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was of the old man, Mr. Garrett, and his knowing eyes. What secrets did he hold? What mysteries lay hidden behind the grand facade of Oakwood Manor? Little did Sarah know, she was about to find out. The library of Oakwood Manor was a sanctuary of knowledge and quiet contemplation. Towering bookshelves lined the walls, their polished mahogany gleaming in the soft light that filtered through the tall windows. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and leather bindings, a fragrance that Sarah had come to associate with wealth and history over the past 2 weeks. Sarah moved methodically through the room, her feather duster dancing over the spines of countless books. She had quickly learned that cleaning the library was as much about preservation as it was about cleanliness. Each time was treated with reverence, carefully lifted and replaced with gentle hands. As she worked, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. Many of these books were first editions, some older than the United States itself. It was a far cry from the dog-eared paperbacks that filled the single bookshelf in her apartment. She had just finished dusting a shelf of what appeared to be 18th century philosophy text when a glint of silver caught her eye. Turning, she spotted an ornate silver frame sitting on a small side table near one of the plush armchairs. A black ribbon was draped across one corner of the frame, lending it an air of mourning. Curiosity piqued, Sarah approached the table. The frame was exquisite, its silver surface etched with intricate floral patterns. It was the kind of object that spoke of old money and refined taste, much like everything else in Oakwood Manor. As she reached out to lift the frame, intending to dust beneath it, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as she stared at the photograph within. It was her. Or rather, it was a younger version of her. The woman in the photo couldn't have been more than 25, her face unlined by the worries and hardships that had etched themselves into Sarah's features over the years. She was laughing, her head thrown back in carefree joy, surrounded by the lush greenery of a park. Sarah's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. She remembered that day, or thought she did. It was a rare family outing, before the kids, before Tom's death. They had gone to the park for a picnic, and Tom had snapped photos all day, capturing her laughter and the simple joy of a beautiful summer afternoon. But how could that photo be here, in this mansion owned by strangers? And why was it displayed like a memorial, as if the young woman in the picture was no longer of this world? Sarah's hands trembled as she held the frame, her eyes drinking in every detail of the photograph. It was undeniably her, the same auburn hair, the same green eyes that looked back at her from the mirror every morning. Yet there was something off about it. Something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The sound of her own ragged breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet library. Sarah glanced around, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was. If someone were to walk in now, how would she explain why she was staring at this photo instead of doing her job? Acting on instinct, Sarah pulled out her phone and quickly snapped a picture of the framed photograph. She needed proof, needed to be able to examine this impossibility in the privacy of her own home. As she hastily replaced the frame on the table, adjusting it to sit exactly as it had before, Sarah's mind whirled with questions. Who was this woman who looked so much like her? Why was her photo here, in this house she had never visited before 2 weeks ago? And why did the Caldwells, or whoever had placed this photo here, believe this woman to be dead? The creak of floorboards in the hallway outside the library jolted Sarah back to reality. Footsteps were approaching. In a panic, she snatched up her feather duster and moved away from the side table, pretending to be engrossed in cleaning a nearby bookshelf. The library door swung open, and Mrs. Havisham's crisp voice cut through the silence. "Mrs. Matthews, have you finished here yet?" Sarah turned, hoping her face didn't betray the turmoil within. "Almost, Mrs. Havisham. Just a few more shelves to go." The head housekeeper's sharp eyes scanned the room, lingering for a moment on the silver frame. Sarah held her breath, but Mrs. Havisham merely nodded. "Very well. When you're done here, the blue room needs attention. The Caldwells will be arriving next week, and everything must be perfect." "Of course, Mrs. Havisham. I'll get right on it." As the door closed behind Mrs. Havisham, Sarah let out a shaky breath. She cast one last glance at the silver frame, its contents now hidden from view but burned into her memory. For the rest of her shift, Sarah went through the motions of her duties mechanically, her mind far away. The mysterious photograph consumed her thoughts. She found herself making rookie mistakes, using the wrong cleaning solution on a delicate surface, knocking over a vase, thankfully without breaking it. By the end of the day, she had received more than one sharp reprimand from Mrs. Havisham. On the bus ride home, Sarah pulled out her phone, staring at the photo she had taken. It hadn't been a hallucination. There it was, her own face, younger and more carefree, smiling back at her from a stranger's picture frame. She was so engrossed in the image that she almost missed her stop. Hurrying off the bus, Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Should she tell someone? But who would believe her? And what if sharing this discovery somehow cost her this job that her family so desperately needed? No, she decided as she climbed the stairs to her apartment. She needed to figure this out on her own first. There had to be a logical explanation. A distant relative she didn't know about, perhaps. Or maybe just an uncanny resemblance. But deep down, Sarah knew that none of these explanations felt right. There was something more to this, something she couldn't yet grasp. As she opened the door to the familiar chaos of her home, Michael arguing with Lily about a video game, Jamie demanding dinner, Sarah made a silent vow. She would uncover the truth behind that photograph, no matter what it took, no matter where it led her. She would solve the mystery of the woman in the silver frame. Little did she know, this decision would set her on a path that would unravel not just the secrets of Oakwood Manor, but the very foundations of her own identity. As she hugged her children and started on dinner, the image of that laughing young woman lingered in Sarah's mind. Who was she really? And what did her presence in Oakwood Manor mean for Sarah and her family? The mystery was just beginning. Sarah's fingers drummed nervously on the steering wheel as she navigated the familiar streets of her childhood neighbourhood. The houses here were modest, a far cry from the opulence of Oakwood Manor, but each lawn was neatly trimmed, each flower bed tended with pride. This was a place where people worked hard for what they had. At the end of Maple Street stood a small bungalow, its pale yellow paint peeling slightly at the edges. Sarah pulled into the driveway, her heart racing. She called her Aunt Maggie that morning, making up an excuse about wanting to look through old family photos. Now, sitting in her car, Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the conversation ahead. The front door opened before Sarah could knock, revealing a woman in her 60s with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. "Sarah, sweetheart," Aunt Maggie exclaimed, pulling her into a warm embrace. "It's so good to see you. Come in, come in. I've put the kettle on." Sarah followed her aunt into the cosy living room, inhaling the familiar scent of cinnamon and old books. Family photos covered every available surface. Sarah's mother as a young woman, Sarah and her cousins as children, more recent photos of Sarah's kids. "So," Aunt Maggie said as she poured tea into delicate china cups, "you said on the phone you wanted to look at old photos?" Sarah nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, I've been thinking a lot about Mom lately, about our family history." A shadow passed over Aunt Maggie's face, so quickly Sarah almost missed it. "Of course, dear. It's natural to want to connect with your roots. What would you like to see?" "Actually," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to show you first." With trembling hands, Sarah pulled out her phone and pulled up the photo she'd taken in the library of Oakwood Manor. She passed the phone to her aunt. "I found this at my new job. It's in this big mansion I've been cleaning. Aunt Maggie, it looks exactly like me, but I don't remember this photo being taken. Can you explain this?" The change in Aunt Maggie was immediate and profound. The colour drained from her face and the teacup she was holding clattered against its saucer. Her eyes, wide with shock, darted between the phone and Sarah's face. Where did you say you found this?" Aunt Maggie's voice was barely audible. "At Oakwood Manor. It's this huge estate owned by the Caldwell family. I've been working there as a housekeeper. Aunt Maggie, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." Aunt Maggie set the phone down on the coffee table as if it were a live grenade. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and when she opened them again, Sarah saw a mixture of guilt, resignation, and deep sadness. "Oh, Sarah," she sighed, "I never thought. Your mother made me promise." "Promise what?" Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Aunt Maggie, please. I need to know the truth." Aunt Maggie nodded slowly. "You're right. You deserve to know. But oh, Sarah, I don't know where to begin." "The beginning is usually a good place," Sarah said, trying to keep the edge out of her voice. Aunt Maggie nodded again, took a sip of her tea and began to speak. "Sarah, sweetheart, the woman in that photo, she's not you. She's your sister. Your twin sister." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sarah gripped the arms of her chair, feeling as if she might float away if she didn't hold on tight. "My twin sister. But that's impossible. I don't have a sister." "You did. You do." Aunt Maggie's voice was thick with emotion. "Her name is Emma. Emma Catherine Matthews." "Emma," Sarah repeated, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. "But how? Why didn't I know about her? Where is she now?" Aunt Maggie reached out, taking Sarah's hands in her own. "It's a long story and a painful one." "Your mother? Oh, Sarah, your mother loved you both so much. But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes life forces us to make impossible choices." As Aunt Maggie spoke, a story unfolded that seemed more like a tragic novel than reality. Sarah learned of her parents' struggles, her father's descent into alcoholism, the mounting medical bills, the constant stress of poverty, and then, when Sarah and Emma were just 3 years old, disaster struck. "You got sick, Sarah. So sick. The doctors, they weren't sure you would make it. Aunt Maggie's voice broke. Your mother was beside herself. She spent every moment at the hospital with you, while your father, well, he couldn't cope. He drank more and more. Sarah listened in stunned silence as her aunt described the impossible choice her mother had faced. With a gravely ill child requiring constant care, mounting medical bills, and an increasingly unreliable husband, Sarah's mother had made the heart-wrenching decision to put Emma up for adoption. She believed it was the only way to give both of you a chance at life, Aunt Maggie explained, tears streaming down her face. Emma would have a chance at a better life with a family who could provide for her, and your mother could focus on getting you the care you needed. The room spun around Sarah. She felt as if she were falling, tumbling through a reality she no longer recognized. But why didn't anyone ever tell me? Why keep it a secret all these years? Aunt Maggie squeezed Sarah's hands. Your mother, she carried the guilt of that decision every day of her life. She convinced herself that it was better for you not to know, that it would only cause you pain. And then, after your father died and you recovered, she was so focused on giving you a good life, on being both mother and father to you. I think she was afraid of losing you too, if you ever found out. Sarah's mind raced, trying to reconcile this new information with her understanding of her family, her childhood, her very identity. Flashes of memories surfaced, times she'd felt inexplicably lonely, moments when she'd caught her mother looking at her with an indescribable sadness. Had some part of her always known? The Caldwells, Sarah said suddenly. They adopted Emma, didn't they? That's why her photo is at Oakwood Manor. Aunt Maggie nodded. Yes, your mother chose them because they could give Emma everything she and your father couldn't. But it was a closet adoption. Your mother never knew what became of Emma after that day. A maelstrom of emotions swept through Sarah. Shock, anger, grief, confusion. She stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something to process this tidal wave of information. She paced the small living room, her aunt watching her with worried eyes. Why? Sarah finally burst out. Why didn't you tell me after Mom died? I had a right to know. Oh, Sarah, Aunt Maggie said, her voice heavy with regret. You're right. You did have a right to know. But your mother made me promise, and after she was gone, I didn't know how to break that promise, how to shatter the image you had of her. Can you forgive me? Sarah stopped pacing, looking at her aunt, this woman who had always been there for her, who had stepped in to be a maternal figure after her mother's death. The anger that had flared so suddenly began to subside, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. I don't know, Aunt Maggie. I need time to process all of this. Aunt Maggie nodded, understanding in her eyes. Of course, sweetheart. Take all the time you need. But Sarah, try not to judge your mother too harshly. The choice she made, it broke her heart. But she truly believed she was doing what was best for both of you. As the initial shock began to wear off, Sarah found herself sinking back into her chair, her mind swirling with questions. What was Emma like? Did she know about Sarah? And most pressingly, what did Sarah do with this information now? The photo, Sarah said suddenly. It had a black ribbon on it. Does that mean... is Emma... Aunt Maggie shook her head. I don't know, Sarah. I'm so sorry, but I truly don't know anything about what became of Emma after the adoption. Sarah nodded, a strange mix of relief and disappointment washing over her. There was still so much to uncover, so many questions left unanswered. As she left her aunt's house that evening, Sarah felt as if she were walking in a dream. The world around her seemed both sharper and less real, every familiar sight tinged with the knowledge of this hidden history. Driving home, Sarah's mind raced with the implications of what she'd learned. She had a sister, a twin, someone out there who shared her DNA, who might have grown up living the life Sarah's mother had wished for both her daughters. And now, by some twist of fate, Sarah found herself working in the very home where her sister had grown up. It was almost too much to believe. As she pulled into her driveway, Sarah made a decision. She would uncover the truth about Emma, about the Caldwells, about the life that could have been hers. Little did Sarah know, this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. The days following Sarah's visit to Aunt Maggie passed in a haze of conflicting emotions and sleepless nights. She went through the motions of her daily life, getting the kids ready for school, cleaning the sprawling rooms of Oakwood Manor, preparing meals, but her mind was elsewhere, constantly churning with the weight of her newfound knowledge. She had a sister, a twin, Emma Catherine Matthews. The name echoed in Sarah's thoughts, a constant refrain that both excited and terrified her. As she dusted the library shelves, Sarah found her eyes constantly drawn to the silver frame that had started it all. The young woman's laughter seemed to mock her now, a reminder of a life she'd never known, of choices made before she was old enough to understand their implications. At home, Sarah struggled to maintain normalcy for her children's sake, but they were perceptive, especially Michael, who had grown so much like his father. "Mum, is everything okay?" he asked one evening as Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, staring blankly out the window. Sarah turned, forcing a smile. "Of course, sweetheart. Why do you ask?" Michael shrugged, his eyes wise beyond his years. "You just seem, I don't know, distracted, like you're here but not really here." Sarah's heart clenched. She crossed the kitchen and pulled her son into a tight hug. "I'm sorry, Michael. I've just had a lot on my mind lately, but I promise, everything's going to be okay." As she held her son, Sarah wondered if her words were a lie. Would everything really be okay? How could it be when her entire understanding of her family, of herself, had been turned upside down? The question that plagued her most was, what should she do now? The temptation to seek out Emma, to connect with this missing piece of herself, was almost overwhelming. But with that desire came a host of fears and doubts. What if Emma didn't want to know her? What if discovering Sarah's existence disrupted the life Emma had built with her adoptive family? And what about Sarah's own children? How would they react to suddenly having an aunt they'd never known about? Then there was the issue of the Caldwells. If they were indeed Emma's adoptive parents, how would they feel about Sarah's presence in their home? Would they see her as a threat? Would she lose this job that her family so desperately needed? After days of internal struggle, Sarah came to a difficult decision. It would be best for everyone if she removed herself from the situation. She would resign from her position at Oakwood Manor, find another job, and try to put this discovery behind her. It was the responsible thing to do, the safe thing. With a heavy heart, Sarah penned her resignation letter. She explained that family circumstances required her to seek employment closer to home, thanked Mrs. Havisham for the opportunity, and apologised for any inconvenience her departure might cause. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Oakwood Manor earlier than usual, intending to hand in her resignation and collect her few personal items before the rest of the staff arrived. The mansion was quiet, the first rays of sunlight just beginning to filter through the grand windows. As Sarah made her way to Mrs. Havisham's office, a movement in her peripheral vision made her start. She turned to see Mr. Garrett, the old man who had watched her so curiously these past weeks, emerging from the shadows of the grand staircase. "Mrs. Matthews," he said, his voice gravelly from disuse, "a moment of your time, if you please." Sarah hesitated, surprised to hear him speak. In all her time at the manor, she'd never heard him utter a word. Curiosity overcame her reluctance, and she nodded, following him into a small sitting room off the main hall. Mr. Garrett closed the door behind them and turned to face Sarah, his rheumy eyes sharp with an intelligence that belied his aged appearance. "You're planning to leave us," he said. It wasn't a question. Sarah's brow furrowed. "How did you—" "I've been with the Caldwell family for over 50 years, Mrs. Matthews. Very little escapes my notice." He paused, his gaze boring into her, including the remarkable resemblance between you and a certain photograph in the library. Sarah's heart began to race. "You know," she whispered. Mr. Garrett nodded solemnly. "I was here the day the Caldwells brought Emma home. Such a tiny thing she was, all big eyes and copper curls. The spitting image of you, Mrs. Matthews. Or rather, you're the spitting image of her." Sarah sank into a nearby chair, her legs suddenly weak. "Why didn't you say anything?" "It wasn't my place," Mr. Garrett replied simply. "But now that you know the truth, I can't stand by and watch you walk away." "But I have to," Sarah protested. "I can't disrupt Emma's life or the Caldwells. It's better if I just leave things as they are." Mr. Garrett's expression softened. "Is it? Better for whom? For Emma, who's never known the truth of her origins? For you, who's just discovered a missing piece of yourself? Or for young Lily?" Sarah's head snapped up. "Lily, what does my daughter have to do with this?" "Not your Lily, Mrs. Matthews. Emma's." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Emma has a daughter?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Garrett nodded. "A beautiful little girl, 4 years old, the apple of her grandparents' eye, and the very image of her mother, and you." Sarah's mind reeled. She had a niece, a little girl who shared her blood, who might have her smile, her laugh. The thought filled her with a longing so intense it was almost painful. "Mrs. Matthews," Mr. Garrett said softly, "I've watched over this family for half a century. I've seen joy and sorrow, triumphs and tragedies. But I've never seen a twist of fate quite like this. You have a chance here, a chance to heal old wounds, to complete a family circle that was broken long ago." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. "This is the Caldwells' address. They're at their summer home now, but they'll return next week for the autumn gala. If you decide to reach out, that would be the time." Sarah took the paper with trembling hands. "But what if they don't want to see me? What if Emma doesn't want to know me?" "That's a risk you'll have to take," Mr. Garrett replied. "But consider this. Do you really want to spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been? Can you walk away now, knowing what you know?" As Sarah stood to leave, still clutching the paper with the Caldwells' address, Mr. Garrett placed a gnarled hand on her arm. "Do it at least for the sake of your sister's daughter," he said softly. "Every child deserves to know their family, their history. You, of all people, should understand that." With those words echoing in her mind, Sarah left the sitting room. She walked past Mrs. Havisham's office, the resignation letter burning a hole in her pocket. Instead, she made her way to the library, to the silver frame that had started it all. Sarah stared at the photo of Emma, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just a stranger who looked like her. This was her sister, her twin, a part of herself she'd never known was missing. And somewhere out there was a little girl, a niece who didn't know she had an aunt, a cousin to Sarah's children. In that moment, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't walk away, couldn't pretend she'd never learned the truth. Whatever the consequences, whatever challenges lay ahead, she had to see this through. She pulled out her phone and called Mrs. Havisham, explaining that she wasn't feeling well and needed to take the day off. Then, with a deep breath, she dialed another number. "Aunt Maggie? It's Sarah. I need your help with something." As Sarah left Oakwood Manor that day, she felt as if she was standing on the precipice of a new life. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential pitfalls and heartaches, but it was also filled with possibility. The possibility of connection, of understanding, of completing a family circle that had been broken for far too long. With the address Mr. Garrett had given her tucked safely in her purse, and the image of a niece she'd never met burning in her mind, Sarah drove home. She had a week to prepare, a week to gather her courage. In 7 days she would meet the Caldwells. She would meet Emma, and nothing would ever be the same again. Sarah sat in her car, parked in front of an elegant townhouse in one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She'd been sitting there for 10 minutes, gathering the courage to step out and walk up to the front door. The address Mr. Garrett had given her was correct. She double-checked it 3 times on the drive over. This was where the Caldwells lived when they weren't at Oakwood Manor. This was where Emma had grown up. This was where Sarah's niece lived now. Taking a deep breath, Sarah finally opened the car door and stepped out. The late afternoon sun warmed her face as she walked up the manicured path to the front door. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the entire neighborhood could hear it. Before she could change her mind, Sarah pressed the doorbell. The cheerful chime seemed at odds with the gravity of the moment. She heard footsteps approaching, and then the door swung open. A woman in her 60s stood there, her silver hair elegantly coiffed, her posture straight and prude. But as her eyes fell on Sarah, the woman's composure crumbled. She gasped, one hand flying to her mouth, the other gripping the doorframe for support. "Emma," she whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah's throat tightened. "No, I'm Sarah, Emma's sister, her twin." The woman's eyes widened in shock. "Richard," she called over her shoulder, her voice shaky. "Richard, come quickly." Moments later, a distinguished-looking man appeared behind his wife. He took one look at Sarah and paled visibly. "Good God," he murmured. "Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell," Sarah said, her own voice unsteady. "I'm sorry to show up like this. I only recently found out about Emma, about our connection. I hope it's okay that I'm here." Mrs. Caldwell seemed to shake herself out of her shock. Of course, please come in." She stepped back, ushering Sarah into a tastefully decorated foyer. "I'm Margaret Caldwell, and this is my husband, Richard. We were Emma's parents." The past tense hit Sarah like a physical blow. So it was true. Emma was gone. Richard Caldwell had regained some of his composure. "Let's sit down," he suggested, leading them into a comfortable living room. "I think we all have a lot to discuss." As they settled onto plush sofas, an awkward silence fell. Sarah found herself studying the Caldwells, noting the grief etched into the lines of their faces, the way Margaret's eyes kept returning to her in disbelief. "You look so much like her," Margaret finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's uncanny." Sarah nodded. "I saw a photo of Emma at Oakwood Manor. That's how I found out. Well, that's how this all started." "You've been to Oakwood?" Richard asked, surprised. "I've been working there," Sarah explained, "as a housekeeper. I had no idea of the connection when I took the job. It wasn't until I saw that photo." She trailed off, unsure how to continue. How could she explain the whirlwind of emotions, the shock of discovery, the painful revelations that had led her here? Richard leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "Sarah, how much do you know about your birth family?" Sarah recounted what her aunt had told her, the story of their parents' struggles, her own illness, the heart-wrenching decision her mother had made. As she spoke, she saw tears welling in Margaret's eyes. "Oh, you poor dear," Margaret said, reaching out to clasp Sarah's hand. "To have gone your whole life not knowing. It must have been such a shock." Sarah nodded, grateful for the older woman's compassion. "It was. It still is, to be honest. There's so much I don't know, so much I want to understand." "What would you like to know?" Richard asked gently, and so began a conversation that flowed like a river breaking through a dam. The Caldwells shared stories of Emma's childhood, her triumphs and struggles, her dreams and disappointments. Sarah was struck by how many similarities there were between her and the sister she'd never known. "She loved to paint," Margaret said, gesturing to a beautiful landscape hanging on the wall. "She had such a talent for capturing light." Sarah smiled. "I love to paint too. It's just a hobby, but it's always been a way for me to relax, to express myself." Richard chuckled softly. She had a terrible sweet tooth. Couldn't resist chocolate in any form. "Me too," Sarah admitted. "My kids know all my hiding spots for emergency chocolate stashes." As they talked, Sarah found herself mirroring Emma's mannerisms, as described by the Caldwells. The way she'd tuck her hair behind her ear when concentrating, the slight tilt of her head when she was curious about something. It was as if some deep, cellular memory was awakening, connecting her to the twin she'd never known. "She sounds wonderful," Sarah said softly. I wish I could have known her." Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. "She was wonderful, and I think she would have loved knowing you, Sarah. She always felt that something was missing in her life. Now I understand why." A comfortable silence fell, filled with shared grief and newfound connection. Then, a small voice broke through the quiet. "Grandma, is someone here?" Sarah's heart leapt into her throat. She turned to see a little girl standing in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. The child looked to be about 4 years old, with copper curls and green eyes that were achingly familiar. For a moment, no one moved. Then the little girl's eyes fell on Sarah, and her face lit up with a joy so pure it was almost painful to witness. "Mommy!" she cried, running across the room. "Mommy, you're back!" Before anyone could react, the child had thrown herself into Sarah's arms, hugging her tightly. Sarah froze, overwhelmed by the wave of emotion that crashed over her. She looked helplessly at the Caldwells, unsure what to do. Margaret had a hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Richard looked pained, but he nodded slightly at Sarah, encouraging her to respond. Gently, Sarah wrapped her arms around the little girl, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair. "Hi, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice choked with emotion. The child pulled back, looking up at Sarah with adoring eyes. "I missed you, Mommy. Where did you go?" Sarah's heart broke. How could she explain to this innocent child that she wasn't her mother? That her mother was gone, and Sarah was just a stranger who happened to look like her. Richard stepped in, his voice gentle. "Lily, honey, remember what we talked about? About Mommy going to heaven?" Lily's brow furrowed in confusion. She looked from Sarah to her grandparents and back again. But she's right here," she insisted. Margaret moved to kneel beside them. "Sweetheart, this is your Aunt Sarah. She's your Mommy's sister. That's why she looks so much like her." Lily's lower lip trembled. "Not Mommy." "No, honey," Sarah said softly, fighting back tears. "I'm not your Mommy, but I'm so, so happy to meet you." The little girl's face crumpled, and she began to cry. Sarah held her close, rocking her gently, her own tears falling freely now. Over Lily's head, she met the Caldwell's eyes, seeing in them a mixture of grief, gratitude, and hope. As Lily's sobs subsided into hiccups, Margaret suggested they look at some photo albums together. Soon they were all seated on the floor, surrounded by books filled with memories. Lily sat in Sarah's lap, pointing out pictures of her mother, telling stories in the disjointed way of young children. Sarah soaked it all in, the photos of Emma growing up, the stories behind each image, the sound of Lily's voice as she shared precious memories of her mother. It was bittersweet, learning about the sister she'd never know, seeing the life she might have had. But there was also a sense of wholeness, of pieces falling into place. As the afternoon turned to evening, Sarah realized she'd been there for hours. She'd need to get home soon, to her own children. But something had changed, shifted in a fundamental way. She wasn't just Sarah Matthews anymore. She was Emma's sister, Lily's aunt, a part of this family that had been separated by circumstance and reunited by chance. Before she left, plans were made for future visits. The Caldwells, despite their initial shock, seemed eager to maintain this newfound connection. And Lily, though still confused, had warmed to the idea of an aunt who looked just like her mommy. As Sarah drove home, her mind whirled with everything she'd learned, everything she'd felt. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, moments of grief and joy in equal measure. But for the first time since discovering Emma's existence, Sarah felt a sense of peace. She had found a missing piece of herself, and in doing so had brought comfort to a grieving family. Whatever came next, she knew she had made the right decision in reaching out. Sarah smiled as she drove, already looking forward to her next visit with the Caldwells and little Lily. The future, once so uncertain, now held the promise of new connections, new love, and a family expanded beyond what she'd ever imagined. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the Caldwells' townhouse, casting a warm glow on the gathering within. Sarah stood in the doorway of the living room, watching as her children tentatively entered the unfamiliar space. Michael, ever the protective older brother, kept a watchful eye on Lily and Jamie as they looked around with wide-eyed curiosity. "Children," Sarah said softly, "I'd like you to meet some very special people." Margaret and Richard Caldwell stepped forward, their faces a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. Sarah had spent hours the previous evening explaining the situation to her kids, but she knew it would take time for everyone to adjust to this new reality. "This is Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell," Sarah introduced. They're your Aunt Emma's parents, which makes them your grandparents too." Michael, at 12, understood the implications best. He stepped forward, extending his hand politely. "It's nice to meet you," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in his eyes. Margaret knelt down, ignoring Michael's outstretched hand, and instead pulling him into a gentle hug. "Oh, my dear boy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're so glad to meet you too." As if a dam had broken, Lily and Jamie surged forward, their initial shyness forgotten. Soon the room was filled with the chatter of children asking questions and grandparents eager to answer them. Sarah watched, her heart swelling with a mixture of joy and bittersweetness. She caught Richard's eye over the heads of the children, and he gave her a small, understanding smile. They both knew that this moment, beautiful as it was tinged with the absence of Emma. As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself sharing stories about her children with the Caldwells. "Michael's our budding scientist," she said proudly, "and Lily here has a real talent for music." "What about me, Mommy?" Jamie piped up, not wanting to be left out. Sarah laughed, ruffling his hair. "You, my little one, are our resident comedian. Always keep us laughing." No, it was during one of these conversations that Margaret's eyes widened in realization. "Sarah," she said softly, "you said our when talking about Lily and Jamie. Are they?" Sarah nodded, understanding the unspoken question. "Yes, Lily and Jamie are adopted. Michael is my biological son, but all three are my children in every way that matters." The Caldwells exchanged a look of wonder. "Just like Emma," Richard murmured. At Sarah's questioning glance, he explained, "Emma and Jake, her husband, they were talking about adoption before we lost her. She always said that love, not blood, makes a family." Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. Another connection, another similarity with the sister she'd never known. The sound of the front door opening interrupted the moment. A man's voice called out, "Mom, Dad, are you home?" Margaret stood quickly. "That's Jake," she explained to Sarah, "Emma's husband. He brings Lily over most days." Before anyone could respond, a tall man with kind eyes and laugh lines entered the room. He stopped short at the sight of Sarah, his face draining of colour. "Emma," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah's heart clenched at the raw hope and pain in his voice. "No," she said gently. "I'm Sarah, Emma's twin sister." Jake blinked, confusion replacing shock. Twin sister? But Emma never mentioned. "She didn't know," Richard interjected, quickly explaining the situation. As understanding dawned on Jake's face, little Lily ran up to him. "Daddy, look! I have a new aunt, and cousins." Jake scooped up his daughter, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. There was a moment of charged silence, filled with unspoken questions and a strange sense of connection. The next few hours passed in a whirlwind of introductions, explanations, and shared meals. The children, with the remarkable adaptability of the young, quickly formed bonds. Lily was thrilled to have cousins to play with, while Michael, Lily, and Jamie were excited by the prospect of a new extended family. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself increasingly drawn to Jake. They shared quiet conversations in the kitchen as they prepared snacks for the children, swapped stories about their kids, and found common ground in their experiences of loss and single parenthood. "It's strange," Jake said at one point, his voice low. "When I first saw you, it was like seeing Emma again. But the more we talk, the more I see how different you are. You're your own person, with your own story." Sarah nodded, understanding. "I feel the same way. I came here hoping to learn about Emma, to understand the sister I never knew. But I'm realizing that this isn't just about the past. It's about the future, too." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the Caldwells' living room, Sarah looked around at the scene before her. Michael was engrossed in a chess game with Richard, both of them wearing identical expressions of concentration. Lily and Jamie were curled up with Margaret, listening intently as she read them a story. Little Lily was dozing on Jake's lap, worn out from a day of excitement. And Sarah felt a sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. Here, in this room with virtual strangers who were somehow family, she felt a piece of herself slot into place. A piece she hadn't even known was missing. As if sensing her thoughts, Jake looked up and caught her eye. He smiled, a smile tinged with sadness, but also warm with new possibility. Sarah felt her heart skip a beat, surprised by the intensity of the connection she felt with this man she'd just met. "Well," Margaret said, closing the storybook and looking around the room with shining eyes, "I think this calls for a family photo, don't you?" There was a flurry of activity as everyone arranged themselves in front of the fireplace. Sarah found herself standing next to Jake, their children gathered around them, with Margaret and Richard beaming on either side. As Richard set the timer on the camera and hurried to join them, Sarah felt Jake's hand brush against hers. Without thinking, she intertwined her fingers with his, feeling a spark of warmth at the contact. The camera flashed, capturing the moment, a new family, born from loss, but blooming with hope. As everyone began to chatter and move, Sarah remained still for a moment, committing the scene to memory. This was not an ending, she realized, but a beginning. A new chapter in all their lives, filled with the promise of love, connection, and the healing power of family, both born and chosen. As she looked around at her expanded family, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead might not be easy, but she knew that together they could face whatever challenges came their way. In that moment, surrounded by love and new possibilities, Sarah finally felt complete.